Hello, and welcome to one of Geekdom Central's podcast-style reviews. I write and edit these reviews specifically with audio in mind, so that you don't need to worry about watching and can listen to me ramble in the background. Today we'll be diving into 2000's X-Men. As this movie is 24 years old now, where does the time go? This will be a full spoiler discussion. This is it, boys and girls, the one that started it all. Don't get me wrong, X-Men certainly wasn't the first superhero movie. However, it is often credited as the primary piece in shifting sentiment around comic book movies from goofy things for kids to, wow, these could actually be real movies. X-Men was the first piece on that board, enabling Sam Raimi's Spider-Man to really kick things into the stratosphere, and the rest is history. Initially, I was going to marathon and review the entire X-Men saga in preparation for Deadpool and Wolverine, but as I got about halfway through scripting The Last Stand, I realized that it would just be way too much work. My channel just isn't really big enough to justify the amount of work that it would be. Instead, I decided to expand my review of the first movie and really dig into what I love, because honestly, I was shocked at how well it holds up. Sure, there's some janky CG here and some odd quirky choices there. However, this movie not only holds up in its own right, but it's almost scarily relevant to a lot of what's happening across the globe, especially in the US. And even further, I'd argue that it could trade blows with the better movies of the MCU while having some strengths of its own that not even the MCU has been able to achieve. One of the things that I found really refreshing about X-Men is that it has a darker tone than most of the Marvel fare that we're now used to without trying too hard to be edgy like a certain other purveyor of comic book films. The movie opens with a 1-2 punch of Magneto's powers awakening in a concentration camp during World War II and Rogue almost killing her boyfriend from kissing him. Later on in the movie, Logan almost kills Rogue by stabbing her through the chest, and we see Senator Kelly turn to goo as his cells deteriorate. All of this is on top of the narrative element that mutants are majorly prejudiced against and seen as no more than weapons walking through society. It's an excellent concoction of themes and narrative arcs that result in a movie that is just terrifically paced. Back to the Future and Hot Fuzz are two of my go-to examples of perfect scripts, or rather, as close to perfect as a script can get, because there's not an ounce of fat on them. Not a wasted scene, not a meaningless line of dialogue, and while X-Men isn't quite on that level, it comes close. The plot moves along very steadily, and there are very few scenes or moments that feel wasted. I do have issues with some aspects, but we'll get to those later. The biggest standout aspect that I felt was done extremely well was how much visual storytelling occurs in this movie, specifically when revealing the powers of the various characters. While most characters get a brief expositional overview of how their powers work, this always comes after the character has already demonstrated their abilities. Meeting Wolverine through Rogue's eyes lets us learn his powers in the same way that she does. She sees cuts heal on his face in real time and sees his claws burst out of his knuckles for the first time. When Storm and Cyclops arrive to save them, we see Storm move a flurry of snow and Cyclops open his visor to reveal his laser vision. We see Jean move a syringe telekinetically, Mystique reveal her true form in a minor plot twist, and Magneto move multiple metal objects. All of this is done without dialogue specifically pointing it out or explaining it, and I love this show-don't-tell angle that was taken, especially as it's increasingly uncommon today as moviegoers are often treated like juvenile idiots, and honestly that goes doubly for superhero movies. Before we discuss the story, I'd be remiss if I didn't comment on the casting, even though I won't be saying anything that hasn't been said many times before. Full disclosure, I have actually read very few comic books, so I don't know how accurate the casting is per the comics. But I always felt like the casting for these movies was top-notch, with Patrick Stewart and Hugh Jackman consistently being highly rated in perfectly cast movie roles lists. My mind will always picture these actors as these characters, although that could be more due to nostalgia than anything, though that's not to say that no one could take up the mantles for these roles, as I thought James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender did a phenomenal job in the later series. At a high level, the story's fairly simple. Magneto is trying to turn everyone into mutants because he feels that humans will always want to dominate them. Charles spends part of the movie trying to figure out his plan, and the remainder of the runtime trying to stop him. Logan gets wrapped up in all of this while trying to protect Rogue. Straightforward, and honestly maybe even a little silly if you take the face value of Magneto's "I will turn everyone into mutants" plan. But one thing that really stuck out to me on this rewatch was just how much nuance there is, and honestly how relevant it is to today's social and political landscape, as I mentioned in the intro. Hearing Magneto's monologue about how terrible humans are, I found myself more than once thinking, he's not entirely wrong. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Charles has a very Boy Scoutish view of humanity. He sees the good in them and chooses to believe that they will one day be accepting of mutants. He believes that humanity has already made progress and will continue to do so. Charles remains ignorant of how hateful and bigoted that humanity can be, and naively believes that mutants just need to try harder and that they'll eventually be accepted. But he's also trying to fight this war without bloodshed and does his best to avoid violence when he can. Eric, on the other hand, refuses to believe that there is any goodness in humanity at all. He believes that the only way to ensure mutant safety is to remove the threat that humanity poses entirely, and while he's not setting out to commit genocide here, it wouldn't take much to push him to that level. See the finale of X-Men 2 as proof of that. I love this dynamic because there's more to it than just one character is clearly right, one is clearly wrong. Both Eric and Charles make valid points, while choosing to be ignorant in other ways and stubbornly stick to their views till the bitter end. They're not trying to kill each other. They have a complex relationship where there is clearly a lot of love, respect, and admiration between the two. They just have vastly differing ideals on how to solve a very complicated problem. Charles is portrayed as a protagonist while Eric is an antagonist, but it's not that cut and dry on a thematic level. I think this movie is a great example of the difference between heroes and protagonists and villains and antagonists. There's often a lot of overlap, but they're not always the same thing. What I found most interesting on this watch, though, was some behavior from Charles that further muddied the morally upright waters. Through the movie, Charles takes it upon himself to read anyone's mind that he chooses to. During a scene when Logan comes in upset that Rogue is missing, before he says this, Charles reads his mind to learn that she's missing. He technically reads Senator Kelly's mind without his permission, only saying that he's there to help, but never actually tells Kelly what he's going to do to him. He controls the minds of Sabretooth and Toad without hesitation, and during this encounter is actually willing to let a policeman die during a game of chicken with Magneto. Controlling Sabretooth, he's threatening Magneto's life, to which Magneto uses a cop's gun to fire it at the cop. After the gunshot goes off, we see that Magneto is stopping the bullet just before entering the cop's head, after which he threatens to use all of the guns to shoot at all of the cops if Charles doesn't back off. Charles didn't know that he was going to stop the bullet from killing the cop. He got lucky that Magneto decided to let the cop live. This is all topped off in the final scene of the movie, where Charles visits Eric in his plastic prison. Eric says, "Doesn't it ever wake you in the middle of the night, that feeling that someday they will pass that foolish law, or one just like it, and come for you and your children? What do you do when you wake up to that?" Charles then responds with, "I feel a great swell of pity for the poor soul who comes to that school looking for trouble." You could argue that he's just protecting the innocent children, which could be true, but to me that speaks to someone who might not be quite as supportive of humanity as he says that he is. When push comes to shove, he'll fight to protect mutant kind above all else. I don't know how much of this morally gray behavior was intended with the script, and how much of it was just a coincidence due to the logistics of filming a movie. As mentioned before, I haven't read any of the comics, but I was always under the impression that Professor X was more of a lawful good type. But I really hope that it was intended, and I choose to believe that it was, as to me it makes Charles a much more engaging character. On a more light-hearted note, one of the other things I enjoyed about the movie's framing of Wolverine is that he's a bit abrasive, shall we say? In modern superhero movies, it feels like protagonists generally have to be all good and super likable unless they're explicitly going through a redemption arc. You'll get sassy characters like Tony Stark, but it doesn't tend to extend much past being snarky most of the time. With Logan, he's obviously a very rough personality when we meet him, and even after meeting with the X-Men and lowering his shields, he's still kind of a jerk. He specifically needles Scott about Jean, partially because he's attracted to her himself, but also because he knows that it upsets Scott so much. And it's framed in a way that we're supposed to laugh at. Oh, look at Logan getting under Scott's skin like that. That's so silly. But when you actually look at what he's doing, it's not behavior that I'd argue most of us would be okay with. But I mean that in a good way, because it shows Logan as a character who is actually flawed. He's not some paragon of virtue who's immediately 100% good just because he chooses to protect Rogue. He makes himself intentionally difficult to get along with, sometimes reasonably, sometimes not, and I like that additional layer of depth. I also like the fun that the movie pokes at comic books, with Logan making fun of people's superhero names and the costumes that they wear. That type of meta humor is very commonplace now, but at the time I think it felt much more clever, as this movie pioneered the genre in a lot of ways. Most of the issues that I have with the movie are nitpicks at best, Storm's accent, anyone, or technical aspects that haven't aged well. Most of the visual effects in the movie still look pretty good. There's a lot of wire work and prosthetics, and a lot of the CG still looks serviceable. But being that the movie is 24 years old, there's definitely a couple of CG shots that range from barely passable to yikes. One of the biggest offenders is during Wolverine and Sabretooth's final battle atop the Statue of Liberty. Sabretooth picks Wolverine up and throws him over the edge. Wolverine's claws catch on one of the spikes of the statue's crown, and he does a 360 around the spike and ends up standing on top of it. Conceptually, it's honestly a pretty cool idea, and I'm sure that in 2000 it looked great, but through today's CGI lens, it looks pretty bad. All of the CG when Wolverine is trying to stop Magneto at the very end in his machine looks pretty rough too. As far as plot nitpicks go, most of this is fairly typical Hollywood logic type stuff. Magneto apparently just magically has a machine that can turn people into mutants that only he can use, and we never really get an explanation for how it works or how he created it. I also found it kind of strange that he would use Rogue to channel his power without actually testing it first. How would we know that it would actually work with Rogue? And speaking of Rogue, I always found her getting her little white hair streak a little silly because it just appears out of nowhere because, reasons. Mystique exists in this universe, and yet we hardly ever see anyone actually checking for her. I know that the response to this is likely, well, that would be boring, watching every character verify their identity every time they meet up, which is completely fair. I'm just making the point that it's kind of funny how she exists. Everyone knows that she exists, and yet there's nothing in-universe that's done to defend against her capabilities. There are so many sequences in the movies where if she had been in disguise, she could have really caused some problems. My only genuine critique of the script is that not all characters are developed very well. Wolverine and Magneto get the lion's share of character development, while the rest of the cast gets barely any. Jean gets a tiny little bit, and Storm and Cyclops essentially get none. Charles does get a bit more than Jean, Storm, and Cyclops, but it's more about him being the opposing force to Magneto than it is about him getting an actual arc and development of his own, especially if my comments about his morally gray potential are just me reading into things that weren't even intended. Being an ensemble cast, along with the movie only being an hour and 45 minutes, the characters definitely suffer from a development perspective. All in all, though, I feel that these complaints are fairly minor in comparison to what the movie accomplishes. It establishes a very compelling narrative with themes that are still relevant today, perhaps even more so. We get a superhero movie that isn't afraid to adopt a darker tone and deal with those themes without feeling ham-fisted or patronizing. We get some fun, if underdeveloped characters, some terrific acting, and a script that moves along at an exceptional pace. It is a movie from the year 2000, so expect a little 2000s era silliness, but I genuinely think that this movie is a superb foray into the world of the X-Men, and I don't know if their MCU counterparts will be able to achieve the same goal, honestly. My thoughts on the current state of Marvel and the MCU is its own separate video, honestly, but on the whole, X-Men feels like the type of movie that Marvel would be too afraid to make because the general tone and themes don't really fit in with the modern MCU. This is especially ironic given that the MCU might not even exist at all without this movie. If you haven't ever watched it, do yourself a favor and check it out. I promise you won't be disappointed.